Well, thanks also for having this occasion to, for the fifth time now in a row, to have the Lifetime Achievement Award on CSSI. And this slide is, I only have one slide, so a very general introduction. In 2012, when we started this, we were hosting, as the Partnership Resource Center, the conference. And then we came up with this novelty of saying, okay, let's award someone who's really had a lifetime achievement in this area. And you can see the list here. Started with Jim, who's here. Thanks, Jim. Then Sandra, then Barbara, then last time in Copenhagen, Peter Glasberger. So I'm really happy that he's also participating through a video. And of course, this year, Dave. And it will be explained to every one of you by Barbara and Sandra in particular why Dave was chosen. For us, it is important to acknowledge also that the award is not just a sort of, well, top publications and that's it, but also societal relevance, impact, a whole story of scholarship in support also of societal service. So in that sense, I'm really happy that Dave now is today also awarded this prestigious award. I think it has become more prestigious ever, also because of the awardees. And maybe one last sentence also, with the award goes a statue, so I hope Dave has it available. And goes a check of, say, very, not really big money, but 1,000 euros in order to give it to a sort of charitable organization of your own picking. So I hope Dave will also explain who or what he chose and why. That's it as an introduction, and I'll leave it now to Barbara and Sandra to do the rest of the introduction.
Okay, so
we'll just sorry, Sandra, will we briefly play Peter's video now, because that would just give a bookend to the last winner before we move to the new one. Megan, are you on the line? Can you play Peter's video?
Yeah, we're ready to go now.
Super.
I regret that I cannot participate in our conference this year, but I would like to inform you on how I used the 2018 award. I gave the award to a project that fits into sustainability goal number 4 on quality education. I conveyed the award to the Kenyan Foundation, Jij ook. This is Dutch and means you too in English. In Kenya, the state finances primary schools. However, there are entrance requirements. Nursery schools prepare for it, but they're also expensive and many families can't afford it. In 2008, a Dutchman who spent his youth in Kenya took the initiative to develop nursery schools for poor children. Nowadays, the foundation runs 2 schools. Mama Daniela, named after the first teacher. This school has 2 teachers and 80 children. Mama Uge, named after the mother of the founder, with 2 teachers and 55 children. After 3 years, the children must be able to read and do some math. They also learn to write in English and Swahili. As the children come from poor level families, drinks and bread are provided at school. Interesting is that the Kenyan schools have a collaboration with some Dutch primary schools. The Dutch schools sustain the Kenyan ones and the children work on common projects. Dear colleagues, our grant was spent on teaching materials, a fresh water provision and new toilets. Please be aware that this kind of small projects can make a valuable contribution to Sustainable Development Goal number 4, the one on education. On behalf of the children, I would like to thank you, and I really hope to see you in live at next conference. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. So, Sandra and Barbara, do you want to?
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, and great to see you, Dave. Barbara and I are going to split the duties because, as most of you know, mentorship is really important. Dave was a mentor to both of us. Neither of us, I think, would be where we are without Dave. So I just want to start by saying how grateful I am to Dave for all of his intellectual, activist, and personal contributions. Back in 1980, I was a new doctoral student, and Dave was a brand new professor at Boston University. where I was getting my doctorate. He had just arrived from Case Western, where he had already mentored and influenced Barbara, and produced some of the early and seminal work on cross-sector collaboration that was going on in Cleveland. It was an era in which companies were forming alliances with other companies. I often tell the story about my own dissertation where I was floundering around trying to figure out what to write about, and one day Dave and Jim Post, who was my chair, sort of hit me on the head and said, "You're going to study public-private partnerships." And here's the setting. I'm like, okay, what are public-private partnerships? And he was an amazing and brilliant mentor, a deep thinker, global activist, a boundary spanner in many different respects. He was doing path-breaking work on cross-sector collaboration and treading the line between being an academic and a practitioner long before that was acceptable or understood. Dave and Barbara's early work actually was on how people could reach out to each other from across very different perspectives, social sectors, and institutions. And he was doing that type of work, now what we call cross-sector collaboration, long before what was called that, or before anyone took it seriously. Further, Dave's work in developing nations used emergent, co-created collaborative processes long before they were popularized or even understood. And let me just give a little bit more detail on his career here. Dave holds an undergraduate degree from Harvard and PhD and JDs from Yale. Most recently, he's been a senior research fellow at the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations at the Harvard Kennedy School, having retired from a position as lecturer in public policy and coordinator of international programs in 2009. Prior to joining the Kennedy School, he was professor of organizational behavior at Boston University School of Management for nearly 20 years, which is where I met him. And during that time, he served as president of the Institute for Development Research, a nonprofit research and consulting organization where he worked alongside his wife, Jane Covey, who ultimately ran IDR when Dave left BU for Harvard. Dave's first academic position was at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Ohio, where he pioneered some of his path-breaking cross-sector work with the Cleveland Project, which we know from some of Jim's work. So there are big connections here. So Dave is best known for his research and for his practice and his research and practice-based consulting on large-scale social transformation and institution and capacity building activities in developing nations. Among his best-known books are Managing Conflict and Organizational Interfaces, Creating Credibility, Legitimacy, and Accountability for Transnational Civil Society, and co-edited books on transnational civil society. I'll put the bio sketch into the chat in a minute. So a couple of key emphases from his work before I turn it over to Barbara. First is the cross-sector emphasis. Dave's career, like his work, epitomizes cross-sector work. He's been what we today call a pra-academic, someone who bridges between academic and practitioner. Still not a highly accepted path, but Dave always carved out his own course. And in the book Intellectual Shamans, I talk about him as one of these mavericks, people who have to follow their own lights, and he certainly did that. The second theme that appears to me is intellectual courage. He's always been courageous intellectually in doing research and in terms of subjects and topics that he chose. Few people were thinking about large system change or cross-sector collaboration when Dave began his work in both of those arenas back in the 1970s. Additionally, few were using methodologies of action research during that era, methods that combine participation, action, and scholarship, and actually which I talked a little bit about. We all needing to be more engaged with that type of research yesterday. Dave was always his own person. Like many innovators and pioneers, people I call intellectual shamans, he chose to follow his own light. He strived to and did find interesting questions. Where people lived, from experience, from observation, from being in the place, not from just looking for some conceptual data in the literature that doesn't really tell us what the real issues people are facing. And he had always a doing good in the world and action practice orientation to his work. So he chose to research topics that are now acknowledged by the Responsible Research in Business and Management Responsible Research in Business and Management Initiative as avant-garde topics, but he was doing this work back in the 1970s. So let me just stop there, turn it over to Barbara, and say congratulations, Dave. Dave, we're so pleased. I'm so pleased that you are getting this award. I think it's well-deserved.
Well, let me just add some personal and a few more professional reflections on Dave. Good morning, Dave. Good morning, everybody. My first encounter with Dave Brown was in a phone call that I placed to him to inquire about the PhD program at Case Western Reserve. I had been directed to phone him at home. When he answered, he quickly said, "I need to call you back. I'm changing Nathan's diaper." Well, that for me was all it took. Here's a liberated Renaissance man, and I knew right away I wanted to go to Case and I wanted him to be my advisor. On a more serious note, I'd like to present Dave to you in his own words. In a 1989 biographical article, Dave articulated 4 themes of his life's work, which have continued throughout his career. And I'm going to go through each one and say a few things about it. The first is an interest in bringing multiple levels of analysis to bear on understanding social dynamics and problems. A systems thinker by nature, Dave always explicitly and implicitly conveyed the idea that you have to think about the big picture as well as the more detailed aspects of a situation. It's because he always thought and brought a holistic perspective, including a multi-level set of understandings to his work, that his doctoral students, including Sandra and I, have taken this perspective as well. I always find it difficult to focus on just a couple of variables and find myself asking, okay, but what about this or what about that? It's nice to finally realize who to blame for that. Dave's own words in 1989 reflect his orientation toward not only seeing the whole picture, but wanting to have an effect on it as well. He said, "I worked and lived at the junctions of different worlds for most of my life. I became aware of multiple realities as I lived in Milton and Bangor, Maine. This awareness was deepened by my experiences in Cambridge and Ethiopia, and with Yale Upward Bound program and the Gates School. I personally feel most comfortable outside or at the edge of social groups in an accepted but relatively autonomous role. I learned to be a maverick early on, but I prefer to be a maverick with influence." Second goal that he articulated is a commitment to working at the points where different groups, organizations, and cultures intersect. Dave has been a pioneer in our field, as Sandra already said. He worked across boundaries to solve difficult problems well before any of the rest of us even understood what he was about. Or in your case of some of you, even before you were a glint in your parents' eye. Not only does his career reflect his own role as a boundary spanner, but his scholarship and his practice work reflect his keen insights into the dynamics that occur when diverse organizations meet and work across interfaces that occur among them. Sandra already mentioned his book, Managing Conflict at Organizational Interfaces. In a 91 paper, he said, "Bridging organizations are central players in an emerging multi-sectoral development paradigm that is less subject to the flaws of the still dominant market-led and state-led paradigms." And he taught people to the skills of being bridgers, from the urban elite in Cleveland, Ohio that Sandra already mentioned, to NGO leaders from Africa, India, and the Philippines, whom he taught to become social entrepreneurs in their own local environments. And Sandra already mentioned that he did this with his wife, Jane Covey, through the Institute for Development Research, which they founded. The third point I want to mention that Dave articulated as a goal is an effort to combine research and action in ways that produce both solutions to specific problems and new ways of understanding social systems. Dave didn't just research partnerships, he fostered them. He worked closely with Peggy Rockefeller Delaney, who founded Synergos Institute to reduce global poverty through partnerships between government, business, civil society, and local communities. And he assisted my colleague at Case Western Reserve, Rajesh Tandon in India, to help him create the Society for Participatory Research in Asia, PRIA, an organization dedicated to training local villagers to improve their own communities through participatory action research techniques. PRIA has been a huge success and doing that for 38 years. And any tribute to Dave's scholarship would not be complete without mentioning his first goal in that 1989 self-reflective piece, a concern for social development and social justice, particularly with respect to improving relations between groups of unequal power. With Dave, awareness and sensitivity to power dynamics was never a side issue. It was always front and center, a prism through which all other information was filtered. This hallmark of Dave's scholarship and practice defines the man. He has devoted his life to improving the voice and political influence of those who have next to nothing in this world. In a 2004 article, he argued successful social entrepreneurship leads to significant changes in the social, political, and economic contexts for poor and marginalized groups. His work among the early voices auguring for multi-sector partnerships was well ahead of the current flurry of research. But he understood only too well that partnerships were not really partnerships at all, unless lower level participants could be empowered to have a voice in their development and management. Now I'd like to end with a few personal reflections. Sandra told you what a wonderful mentor Dave was. Now I'll tell you the real story. My first Academy of Management presentation was in 1978, and it featured joint work that Dave and I had done in a symposium in which Dave organized with Carl Weick as the discussant. Remember, this is my first presentation at the Academy. As if this weren't stressful enough, I still remember Dave threatening to pour the jug of cold water on me if I ran over my designated time for the presentation. I also learned a lot from Dave about how to write up a research paper. Since this effort, when I was doing it, predated word processing, I typed up my first draft and then gave it to Dave to review. When I got it back, it had literally pasted words over my words. Dave had typed out words and pasted them on top of my words, and I felt like, where are my words? They're gone. Finally, I had Dave to thank for finishing my dissertation in 4 years. He informed me in no uncertain terms that if I didn't finish by June 28th of 1979, I would have to wait 1 full year to graduate because he was heading off to do his Fulbright in India, working with Rajesh. So you can see that I learned a lot about the execution of power by having Dave as my mentor. To conclude, although I'm being playful about these incidents, I hope you can see that I owe an incredible debt to Dave. Thank you, Dave, as a mentor, co-author, partner in crime, and as a friend. Both he and his wife, Jane, dedicated their lives to making the world a better place. I'm a better person and a scholar through knowing and working with both of them. Sandra's and my careers bear the indelible imprint of Dave's influence as a scholar, and my career bears that indelible influence as well. Dave was a mentor par excellence. From our perspective, Dave Brown was an early pioneer in our field and a maverick with influence. And that is why he is receiving the CSSI 2020 Lifetime Achievement Award. Congratulations, Dave, on your many, many achievements.
There we are. Okay. Well, thank you. I must say, I appreciate the things that Barbara and Sandra said. It does suggest a caution about smart-ass graduate students, because they may come back to haunt you later on. And while I appreciate the notion that I was ahead of my time and intellectually courageous and going off and the directions I went, I think an alternative explanation is that I was oblivious, and that I was sort of pursuing what I was interested in, and not terribly conscious that it probably wasn't a smart idea career-wise. But all that said, I very much appreciate the award and all the things that Barbara and Sandra said. And when Barbara called me, I was also oblivious to CSSI and the work that you do. So I said to her and to Sandra, well, what do people say in keynotes? And they said, well, you ought to talk about your experiences and what you've learned about power and scaling up. So I've also learned when I've got good advice, and that's what I'm proposing to do now. Can I get this screen to advance? There we go. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects. Leadership Cleveland, which has already been mentioned. The study we did of local development partnerships in Africa and Asia, which has also been mentioned, and then the International NGO Charter Initiative. And for each of those, I want to talk a little bit about what I think we learned about power and scaling up. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the world is changing. I didn't realize that I was going to get that my penchant for trying to look at the larger system was going to get talked about, but I thought it might make sense to talk about the larger system that's going to face all of you that are going to continue doing this work. So what I want to start with is Leadership Cleveland. And in the late 70s, the city of Cleveland was basically a mess. It had serious racial tensions. There was a lot of conflict between labor and management. There was a lot of tension between business and government. And it had the classic Rust Belt problems of heavy industry moving either to other countries or to the south. And as a consequence, in 1977, Cleveland defaulted on its debt payments, having the distinction of being the first city since the Depression, first major US city since the Depression to do that. That was also about the time that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire and distinguished Cleveland for having pollution beyond most places. So some of the city leaders decided that they really ought to think about trying to promote more cooperation among different people in the town, and they decided to do Leadership Cleveland. And Leadership Cleveland basically was bringing together 50 of the sort of next generation leaders from different sectors. And let me show you a slide that captures that. And the idea was they would have a startup retreat for 3 days, and then for 9 months, they had 1 day a month where they came together for a day on one of 9 problems in the city. And that day would be organized by a subgroup of participants. And it involved things like on the day they looked at law enforcement in Cleveland, the participants in the program rode around in police cars the night before and saw what the police were doing, and then came together to talk about the challenges that they'd learned about. And after 9 months of these 1-day sessions, they had another 3-day retreat to talk about what they were going to do with all this. And one of the things that emerged is a pretty widely shared sense of what the kind of problems were that faced the city. Another was expanded connections across the participants. So we did some follow-up research that looked for the next several years at who contacted who within the city. And we had some background data, pre-data. And it was clear that the program did increase the extent to which people talked across races and across sectors. This was they had 3 classes of Leadership Cleveland. The the last one in 1981. In 1986, Jim Austin and his gang from the business school, Harvard Business School, came and did a series of cases called the Cleveland Turnaround, in which they credited Leadership Cleveland with having a significant impact on the improvement of the situation in the city. So to come on to the issue of power and scale in this case, one of the things that I think made a difference there in terms of evening out the power differences among the parties was to develop shared diagnoses, to recognize that everybody was paying a price for the kinds of problems that the city was experiencing, and that there were a lot of resources that weren't being mobilized in coordinated directions because of the tensions across the various boundaries. One of the things that happened was stereotypes got diffused, particularly by the working together to organize the program days. So one of the senior corporate leaders said to me as the program went on, you know, this is going to be good for people in my organization, because a lot of them think anybody who's in the nonprofit sector is no good, because if they were any good, they'd be in the for-profit sector. And I think a lot of the people in the corporate jobs found that some of the nonprofit leaders were pretty high-powered as well. The experience developed a bunch of informal alliances among the sort of emerging leaders, and that led to credibility with their organizations, so that it was possible for a business to cooperate with a community organization, in part because senior people in each organization knew each other and trusted each other. And finally, as the program went on, it became known in the city as a good experience. And that led to wider credibility and influence with the rest of the city. I think scaling up got encouraged partly because what were interpersonal networks became interorganizational networks as people went back to their organizations. I think the Leadership Cleveland often acted as a microcosm, so it replicated the conflicts and the dynamics of the city at large, but it also gave people who were replicating those conflicts an opportunity to figure out how they might change some of those dynamics. So we ended up thinking this is an example of what we called a small intervention for a large problem, that using interpersonal networks among emerging leaders that influence interorganizational activities was a kind of social political judo that had a lot of promise for influencing big problems. Now, let me move on to the next project. A few years later, after I came back from India and moved to Boston, we started a project that was looking at local development partnerships in Asia and Africa, with the question, can partnerships between local people and governments and NGOs and businesses foster local development? And the first goal was to identify examples of successful projects, and then to identify elements that were important to success. The key actors in this coalition were the Synergos Institute in New York, the Society for Participatory Research in Asia in New Delhi, the African Association for Literacy and Adult Education in Nairobi, and IDR in Boston. And we had some sponsorship from organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the UN Development Program and the Institute for Sustainable Development. And we ended up identifying 13 cases. And you see those cases here in the list. The ones with asterisks were ones that we ended up classifying as clear successes. And let me just give you a little bit of an example in terms of the Pakistan Urban Sanitation Project. This was in the Orangi area of Karachi, which is a slum of about 1 million people. And an NGO called the Orangi Pilot Project interviewed people in a number of slum neighborhoods and found that they all were unhappy about the lack of latrines and sewage disposal systems. So they organized lane organizations in these neighborhoods, they called them lanes, to dig sewers and collector drains. And that turned out to be something that was quite simple to do. In other words, there were a lot of people living in these lanes who were sufficiently concerned about sewage, so they were quite willing to dig latrines. And the Orangi Pilot Project developed a simple way of, simple and cheap way of building drains, etc. And so they ended up, I think, the costs were something like $9 per latrine. And the lane organizations spread throughout Orangi and eventually got to be an association of lane organizations that could put pressure on the city council to build collector drains and sanitation systems. So, and processing systems. So over time, the project organized something like 6,000 lane organizations and built 64,000 latrines that served 250,000 people. So they had a real impact on Orangi in doing that. And so let me just continue this. So the process of this study was identifying cases was a challenging element. But we talked to NGOs and to UNDP and the World Bank, and eventually identified these 13 cases and identified case writers who could, local case writers who could write them up. Then we had a workshop of those case writers to look at first drafts and to make suggestions about what the next draft should look like. And then we had a series of case analyses workshops, one in Asia and one in Africa, to look at the cases from those regions and begin to figure out what are the critical ingredients for successful partnerships. And we ended up defining success in terms of how many people were reached and how, to what extent was there support for continuing. So if it affected more than 100,000 people, we called it wide reach. And 10,000 to 100,000 was medium reach. And the resources for sustainability were, were there local grassroots organizations and NGOs and government organizations committed to continuing the project. And it had to, in order to be classed as a clear success, it had to have both the resources for, high resources for sustainability and wide impact. One of the things that we ended up deciding was, then we looked at the successes and compared them to the moderate successes and the qualified successes. Now, two things got to be clear there. One was that the social capital of either local organizations like the lane organizations or bridging relationships between grassroots groups and governance organizations and NGOs were crucial to getting the project started and scaled up. And grassroots voice in key decisions was the central element that led to scaling up in large scale terms. And that depended on either having effective grassroots organizations or trusted NGOs that mediated among the various actors. So as a result of this study, we ended up disseminating the results through UNDP. One of the sponsors commissioned 4 different booklets to come out of it. We wrote the paper for World Development that compared across all the cases. And we ended up writing a chapter for a USAID handbook on partnership development. So there were, it was new enough in this area so that there were a lot of opportunities for influencing donors. So power and scale in these cases seemed to me to, one of the elements for managing the differences, for instance, between the men in the lane organizations and the government of Karachi was NGOs that were trusted by both sides and could broker joint action. The second element of power development was organizing grassroots actors, which in essence created new resources in Karachi, for example, to respond to the project of latrines. And then emerging alliances among those grassroots actors could empower them to influence other players as well. In terms of scaling up, the experience of NGOs and grassroots organizations could be replicated by others. And as other groups like Other Lanes in Karachi learned about what had happened in Orangi, they replicated those activities. And alliances could influence beyond the partnership, the state organizations like the Karachi government. Also changed the meaning of key concepts in some cases. In the case in the Philippines, the case was about urban renewal, which started out as an urban redevelopment program where the World Bank agreed with the government of the Philippines that they would bulldoze the Zone 1 foreshore, Tondo foreshore development slum in Manila. And then the grassroots organizations got so strong, they decided, well, let's just renew the existing housing instead of bulldozing it and building something else, because that project became the training ground for a generation of community organizers in the Philippines. And finally, some of these projects reshaped the development strategies of international actors. So UNDP, for instance, took on development partnerships as a thing, a weapon in their toolkit for doing development in various places. So let me shift to the third project, which was one that wasn't mentioned in the introduction, partly because it's not really intersectoral partnership in the same sense. In the 90s, when I was at late 90s and early aughts, we began to work at the Hauser Center with a lot of international advocacy NGOs. And this project focused on the issue of how do international NGOs build their legitimacy to influence global policies and practices. One of the challenges for many of them is they got dismissed by corporations and by government, international corporations and government agencies as being irrelevant. So the initial actors in this program were several sort of key international NGOs that had a lot of visibility, like Transparency International and Civicus and ActionAid International and so on, as you see there. And in 2003, we had a retreat of the CEOs of about 10 of these organizations to talk about global campaigns and global policy influence. And in the course of that, the issue of legitimacy and accountability emerged. So in 2004, we had a second meeting of the same CEOs to talk about a paper that the Hauser Center put together on the legitimacy and accountability of international NGOs. And that led to a CEO task force to explore what would be a way for international advocacy NGOs to build their legitimacy and accountability. And in 2005, we met again to discuss a draft charter of accountability that by that time was focused on all international NGOs, not just advocacy NGOs, and to incorporate an implementing organization that would be charged with helping organizations that signed on to the charter to carry out its provisions. And in 2006, we had a meeting of 11 international NGOs that signed the first charter and publicized it in an international press conference in Geneva. And a year or two later, the organization, the accountability organization, recruited the Global Reporting Initiative, which was doing this work for businesses and for governments, to create a set of standards and processes by which all the members who signed on to this charter could demonstrate that they were in fact accountable and build their legitimacy. By 2020, there were, I think, 29 international NGO members working in 150 countries that were signatories to the charter and carrying out its requirements. And at least one study I read several years later suggested that was in fact having an impact on their legitimacy, and they were indeed producing significant amounts of information on how they were accountable to the various constituents. So this is, again, in the power differences. There were indeed power differences among some of these NGOs when it started, partly because of their influence from previous performance. The fact that they all recognized that legitimacy was going to be important as an element of their influencing other actors, and that they saw their interdependence for that legitimacy. And that is, if one or two NGOs got caught doing something illegitimate, it influenced the reputation of them all. So the discussions also led to building shared influence strategies and shared transnational campaigns. In the concept of scaling up to impacts outside, building the concepts and measures that were parallel to government and business legitimacy made them understandable and credible with government and business targets. Organizing independent validation of the concepts and standards and people's performance was also important. And catalyzing global attention to other campaigns influenced wider communities of NGOs and other sectors, as in the sort of Publish What You Pay campaign. Now, those are the three cases. They are quite different in the sense of being at different levels. Leadership Cleveland really focused on the one city. The development partnerships were lots of different regions and lots of different kinds of challenges. The NGO charter, INGO charter, really was worried about cross-sector global influence. But power balancing and scaling up themes tended to emerge across these projects. So mediators were critical to enable participation, manage conflicts, and balance power across many of them. Developing a shared analysis really helped with mutual influence in new concepts. Action plans that built the social capital, a sense of trust and reciprocity among the partners, and learning from experience were central to most of these projects. And participant credibility in organizations enabled external leverage in a lot of cases. Again, the scaling up process looked to me like microcosms as bases for learning, and responding to macrocosm problems was a very common pattern. Learning from pilot successes was a basis for scaling up in lots of cases. This example, the lane organizations in the Philippines. New organizations like the charter organization for the international NGOs enable them to scale up both over time and over wider participants. And in several cases, the choice of sponsors and participants made a big difference in expanding the results of the project. So for example, the UNDP's support for the local development partnerships led to support for books based, or sort of advertising booklets based on those experiences that then UNDP used in its pressing for that kind of partnership in other places. So let me shift now. I want to talk about how the world is changing. Because these projects happened from the 1970s through the 2000s. And that was a period when we had the Cold War end, globalization was growing, there was impressive productivity growth and poverty reduction in lots of places. The information revolution was changing and disrupting how we do lots of things. There was increasing concentration of wealth. The rise of civil society was a clear pattern, and cross-sector partnerships emerged as being a credible way of doing things. And those are all observations that come from me. The observations about the future come from the National Intelligence Council, which is a US organization that does a forecast, or at least an analysis of what they think is going to emerge in the next couple of decades every 4 years. And their most recent forecast was in 2017. And they talked there about the wealthy countries are aging, the poor countries are all young and have rapidly growing populations, many of them. Globally, there's weak economic growth. The technology is continuing to change, and as a result is promoting more divisions and disruptions. There's a lot of tribalism and nationalism emerging, which is pushing for more conflict and exclusion. Governance is going to be challenged by flat revenues and polarization. The conflict is going to be increasing as a consequence both of major powers competition and terrorism and weak states and disruptive technologies and climate change and health things. And I wrote this list predated the pandemic. So the pandemic has not reduced the amount of wars and conflict that are emerging. These days in the US, you can get in a fight about whether you have a mask on or not. So these are all patterns that are not making it easier. I think I may have had the benefit of a golden age of partnership development, and those of you who are in the midst or launching your careers may have tougher sledding. The second thing this analysis did was to articulate 3 different scenarios for how to analyze how these problems are emerging in different regions. And these 3 scenarios they called the islands, orbits, and communities scenario. And let me tell you a little bit about each of these. Now, the islands scenario basically reflects on the notion that national protectionism and slow growth is leading to more concern with national rather than global issues. So Brexit and the restrictions on immigration and the scenes we see with nationalistic wall building reflect a kind of pushback against globalization and an increasing internal focus that may be enhanced or escalated by climate change and pandemics and result in all kinds of shortages and nationalism and refugees and terrorism. And from the point of view of those of us who are interested in how do you make collaboration across sectors happen, it may mean that you have to put more focus on identities and on reduced resources and on culture value differences and do that within a national context rather than a global context. The orbit scenario suggests that we are seeing more interest in regional spheres of influence. So the Belts and Roads Initiative of China, or the issues to try and hold and reconstruct the European Union, or Russian influence, or the maintained US no longer hegemony, reflects the sort of emergence of national or larger spheres of influence, larger orbits around central organizations. And that may mean more concern with regional consolidation and solidarity, concerns with regional climate management that then may have impacts across regions as well. How do you deal with the fiscal burdens of a slow economy and US retrenchment? And it may well be that cooperation and partnerships within orbits in regional terms start being more important, or cooperation across orbits, cross-regional initiatives may become critical. And the third scenario is the community scenario, looking at the expansion of networks at lots of different levels, networks organized around key issues. So it may be that local nets become key problem solvers, enabled by increases in information and communications technology, driven by local government reactions to corruption and failure. And multi-stakeholder networks may become the drivers of change across regions in various ways. And here, the cross-sector initiatives may be important to deal with various kinds of state failures and the decentralized government problems, or just the emergence of problems that nobody is responding to. So what I ended up thinking as I sort of worked further on these regions, these different scenarios, is that the challenges facing cross-sector initiatives are going to increase. We're going to be more on managing value tensions and social identities and polarization of various sorts. We're going to have to continue to cope with disruptive technologies and super empowered individuals. We're going to have to deal with resource challenges that may be posed by pandemics and environmental declines and multi-level conflicts. And the arenas are likely to vary as well. Sort of working within national islands that are retreating from global challenges, or within regional orbits and spheres of influence, or across international communities and local and transnational networks. I think the stakes and the payoffs for effective cross-sector interventions are going to escalate. That it isn't going to get easier, but it may well get more important. So, thank you. Good luck.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David. That was really extraordinary. I know on a personal level, I think what you've put up to us as a community is really extraordinary, a very interesting analysis and insightful and thought-provoking and yeah, challenging, but making things very clear. I think it's very, very, very interesting. Thank you so much for doing that. We actually do have a few minutes for questions. We haven't really prompted it in the chat, so there hasn't been. But if anyone would like to ask, respond, or to ask a question, I just ask you to unmute yourself. We have about. We could take a good 10 minutes for this, if you wish. So we could have your colleagues could respond to you, or anyone else in the room can unmute and ask a question.
I'll ask Dave a question.
Yes.
So, Dave, you were a mentor to a number of people beyond just me and Barbara. What advice would you give to junior scholars these days in this sort of fraught context we're living in?
I would start by saying you ought to take my advice with a grain or two of salt, because I was good at some strategies, but I don't think I was ever very good at career strategy. I think the major principle for me has been following energy. That if I could get excited about it, then I would invest time and energy in it. And if it bored me, I was not good at sticking with it. And in my case, a lot of the characteristics that Barbara and Sandra talked about are I mean, I think I wanted to be a maverick with clout is accurate. but I think I also was frequently pursuing stuff just because I was excited about it. And in my case, I have a lot of energy for things I'm excited about, and not very good at things that I find dull. And I guess the other thing that I would say for young people is I came away from reading the Intelligence Council's report and thinking about the things they talked about, thinking there's a lot to do. And we are seeing in the US right now how much we've left undone on a lot of issues. So figuring out how to collaborate on some of these thorny issues is going to be very, very important to what our shared future is like. And we don't really have an option, I think, about shared. We're going to have to all deal with climate change. We're going to have to all deal with polarization and so on. And I could go on, but I won't.
I have a question, Dave, that regards the bridging work that you were able to do. What do you think? I think that some people can do it and some people can't. And I don't know if it's a question of personal attributes or it's a question of connections or both, but I mean, I know many times that you were approaching organizations trying to persuade them to do something. How did you, what advice would you give to young scholars who want to follow in a path like yours, which is to do something novel and different, but don't necessarily have the connections or don't know how to go about doing that? How you know, drawing from your experience, how did you do that?
That's an interesting question. And I think one of the things that we did at IDR when Jane and I started it is we built on the fact that we just come back from India, where I'd had a Fulbright lectureship at an Indian institution, but also one of our lifelong friends who was a graduate student at the same time Barbara was, Rajesh Tandon, was starting an NGO. And so Priya, which is the partner in the local development partnerships study, I think Priya's first grant was a joint project between Priya and IDR. And was also it was IDR's first grant from USAID. And we did that project and discovered we liked working together. And we already knew that from CASE. But a lot of IDR's work with NGOs in the developing world grew out of our relationship with Priya, because Priya became a regional force quite early in the game. And their credibility got shared with IDR. So I would meet people that I hadn't met from a country that I wasn't familiar with, but Rajesh would say, "This is Dave, he's okay." And in essence, we, fairly early in IDR's experience, we got a grant from the Ford Foundation to do an Asian NGO Leadership Fellows Program, NGO Leadership Fellows Program. And for 3 years, we had 12 or 15 leaders from 6 Asian countries spend a month in Boston with us, looking at strategy and various issues. And then they'd go back to their organizations, and they were selected to be key NGO leaders. At the end of that program, IDR had a network in these 6 countries to die for, because we knew all these people and had personal relationships with them, and got guided by them when we were doing work in their countries. And it happened in spite of, I remember a senior Bangladeshi NGO leader saying to me, after we'd been working together for 3 or 4 years, Dave, I know you work for the CIA. I just can't figure out what the hell they think they're getting from you. Now, he was pretty sure all Americans were working for the CIA, but most of them he didn't want to work with, and he continued to work with us for years. So I do think that you can build on initial connections, but that building trust is something that takes time and energy, but it doesn't go away once it's built. So, yeah, just to say one more thing about that, Barbara and Sandra didn't mention it, but I also spent a couple of years after college as a community organizer for the Peace Corps in Ethiopia. And that had a huge impact on me. I mean, I think that definitely shaped the fact that I was very interested in development and so on. And part of what happened in that experience was I tried to build some organizations and failed abysmally, and came away with an abiding sense of there's a lot of unfairness out there that needs work. So.
Thank you, Dave. I actually have two questions from the group. They're two very different ones, so I'm gonna see how we get on. But I'll come to Tessa's question, Tessa Nagy, because and I'm going to add my own to hers. I'm going to be greedy, because she's asking about, you know, because you're advocating, or one of the models is the community-driven model, and she's wondering about then the role of multinationals, you know, in this anti-globalized or retracting kind of world. And I wanted to sort of just add to that, do you have a favored one of any of those three models that you've put out, and you know, and why would you be gravitating towards one of those right now?
Of the three models being the three projects?
No, the kind of the framework you put out at the end in terms
of scenarios.
It's not exactly, yeah.
Okay, I think the creation of scenarios is a strategic planning tool for, they're not predicting that one of those is more likely than the other. They're saying they're different ways of analyzing the possibilities out there. So given that, I was particularly interested in the transnational network model, not too surprisingly, since I've been fooling around with that for a long time. And I think there are a lot of possibilities there. Part of the issue is finding a way of framing the issues so a lot of different players are interested in figuring out how to engage it. But can you repeat the first question? Because I think I answered yours without responding to.
And if we have the time, we're running short of time now, but it's more like in that third scenario, which is going to be very much community driven, kind of that